What if the fate of hundreds of millions of people rested on a single conversation between two men who despised everything the other stood for, and one of them had only been in power for a few weeks? In the spring of 1945, the world stood at the edge of an extraordinary transformation. The guns of the Second World War were still roaring across Europe when Harry Truman, a former senator from Missouri who had been vice president for only 82 days, suddenly found himself sitting in the Oval Office after the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt on April 12, 1945. Truman had been kept largely in the dark about the most sensitive diplomatic arrangements of the war, including the agreements reached at the Yalta Conference in February 1945, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had sketched out the post-war order of Europe in broad, deliberately vague strokes. Stalin had made promises: free elections in Poland, self-determination for liberated nations, a democratic future for Eastern Europe. But even as the ink on those promises dried, Soviet forces were systematically installing communist-controlled governments across Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. Truman inherited not just a war, but a diplomatic powder keg that his predecessor had carefully avoided detonating. The new president read the cables, studied the intelligence reports, and reached a conclusion that Roosevelt had been reluctant to accept. Stalin was not honoring the agreements. He was methodically building an empire, and the Western allies were watching it happen in real time, almost powerless to stop it. Truman was blunt, direct, and deeply suspicious of Soviet intentions from the very beginning of his presidency. He would not wait long before making that suspicion known. If you find this story as gripping as it deserves to be, please subscribe to this channel, like this video, share it with someone who loves history, and leave a comment telling us what you already knew, and what surprised you most. The confrontation that history remembers came on April 23, 1945, just 11 days after Truman took office. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov was passing through Washington on his way to the founding conference of the United Nations in San Francisco, and Truman requested a meeting at the White House. Molotov was a seasoned, cold-blooded diplomat, one of the architects of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, a man who had survived Stalin's purges by becoming indispensable, by being ruthless, by never showing weakness. He arrived at the White House expecting the kind of careful, deferential treatment he had received from Roosevelt, a man who believed that personal charm and patience could soften the Soviets over time. What he found instead was something entirely different. Truman had prepared himself for this meeting by consulting his most senior advisors. Secretary of War Henry Stimson and General George Marshall urged caution, warning the president not to jeopardize the military alliance before the war against Japan was finished. But Ambassador Averell Harriman, who had spent years dealing with the Soviets in Moscow, told Truman plainly that Stalin respected strength and interpreted kindness as weakness. Secretary of State Edward Stettintinius shared similar concerns about Soviet behavior in Poland. Truman listened to all of them, weighed their counsel, and then decided to follow his own instincts. He would be direct. He would be firm. He would make it unambiguously clear that the United States expected the Soviet Union to honor its written commitments. Truman met Molotov in the Oval Office and wasted no time on pleasantries. He told the Soviet foreign minister in plain, unvarnished language that the United States expected the Yalta agreements on Poland to be honored, that free elections must be permitted, and that Soviet actions in Eastern Europe were a direct violation of what had been agreed upon by 3 heads of state just weeks earlier. Molotov, unaccustomed to being spoken to with such directness, reportedly told the American president that he had never been talked to like that in his life. Truman's response became one of the most quoted lines of his presidency: "Carry out your agreements and you won't get talked to like that." Truman's confrontation with Molotov was not an impulsive act of diplomatic rudeness. It was a calculated signal, the first clear announcement that American foreign policy had changed. To understand the full weight of that moment, it is necessary to travel back to Yalta, to that deteriorating Tsarist palace on the Black Sea coast of Crimea, where between February 4 and February 11, 1945, the 3 great Allied powers had attempted to design the post-war world. Roosevelt arrived at Yalta visibly ill. He would be dead in 2 months, and deeply committed to maintaining the Soviet-American alliance. He believed that the United Nations, which he considered his greatest legacy, could only function if the great powers remained united. Churchill was more skeptical of Stalin's intentions, having already negotiated the so-called percentages agreement with the Soviet leader in Moscow in October 1944, where the 2 men had informally divided influence over the Balkans on a sheet of paper, Romania and Bulgaria heavily in the Soviet sphere, Greece predominantly under British influence, Yugoslavia split. But Yalta went further. It produced a formal declaration, the Declaration on Liberated Europe, in which the three powers pledged to support democratic institutions and free elections in the nations freed from Nazi occupation. Stalin signed it. He signed it knowing, in all likelihood, that he had no intention of honoring it in any country where Soviet troops were already stationed. Poland was the most urgent and painful case. The Polish government in exile, based in London, had fought alongside the Western Allies throughout the entire war. Yet at Yalta, it was agreed that a new, provisional government of national unity would be formed in Poland, based on the Soviet-backed Lublin Committee, a communist-controlled body that Stalin had been nurturing since 1944. The London Poles were to be included, yes, but in what proportion and with what real power remained deliberately undefined. Stalin had no intention of allowing genuine pluralism in a country that sat directly on the land corridor between Germany and the Soviet Union, a corridor through which Russia had been invaded twice in the previous 30 years. Poland was not a diplomatic question for Stalin. It was an existential security matter. And Truman, studying those agreements in April 1945, understood exactly what was happening. The situation in Poland in the weeks leading up to the Truman-Molotov meeting had deteriorated dramatically, and the details were deeply alarming to anyone who cared about the agreements signed at Yalta. In March 1945, Soviet authorities had invited 16 leaders of the Polish underground, men who had fought the Nazis for years, who represented the legitimate democratic resistance, to a meeting under the pretext of negotiations about forming the unity government that Yalta had promised. They arrived in good faith, trusting Soviet assurances of safe conduct. They were arrested immediately, taken to Moscow, tried in June 1945 on fabricated charges of anti-Soviet activity, sentenced to prison terms ranging from 4 months to 10 years. Among those arrested was General Leopold Okalicki, the last commander of the Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, an organization of hundreds of thousands of fighters who had resisted German occupation at enormous human cost, including the catastrophic Warsaw Uprising of August and September 1944, during which the city was virtually destroyed and over 150,000 civilians died while Soviet forces famously waited on the eastern bank of the Vistula River. The arrest of the 16 was not a secret. It became a major international incident. The British and American governments protested vigorously. Stalin responded with the calm indifference of a man who knew that his army occupied the territory in question and that no Western power was willing to go to war over it. This was the context in which Truman met Molotov. This was the backdrop against which those blunt words were spoken in the Oval Office. Every diplomat, every general, every intelligence officer in Washington knew what was happening. The question was no longer whether Stalin was violating Yalta. The question was what, if anything, could be done about it. The weeks and months that followed the April confrontation were marked by deepening tension and increasingly bitter exchanges. Harry Hopkins, one of Roosevelt's closest advisers and a man who had cultivated a personal relationship with Stalin, was sent to Moscow in late May 1945 at Truman's request, carrying a message that was both firm and conciliatory. The United States valued the alliance, but it required the Soviet Union to live up to its commitments. Hopkins met with Stalin 6 times between May 26 and June 6, 1945, and the conversations were detailed, substantive, and ultimately revealing. Stalin was gracious in person, as he often was with foreign visitors, warm, attentive, unhurried, while simultaneously making it clear that Soviet security interests in Eastern Europe were not negotiable. He spoke at length about Russia's historical suffering, the 27 million Soviet citizens who had died in the war, the necessity of having friendly governments on Soviet borders. He agreed to allow a small number of non-communist Poles to join the provisional government, a concession small enough to be essentially meaningless but large enough to allow the Western powers to claim that Yalta was nominally being implemented. The Hopkins mission produced an agreement of sorts. The reorganized Polish Provisional Government of National Unity was recognized by the United States and Britain in July 1945, but the London Poles, the genuine representatives of democratic Poland, were largely sidelined. Stanislaw Wojciech, the leader of the Polish Peasant Party and a figure of genuine democratic credibility, returned to Poland hoping to compete in free elections. He would find himself systematically harassed, his party infiltrated and undermined by communist security forces, his supporters arrested and intimidated. By 1947, elections held under conditions of blatant fraud would produce an overwhelming communist majority. Wojciech fled Poland in October 1947 to avoid arrest. The pattern repeated itself across Eastern Europe with grim consistency. The Potsdam Conference of July and August 1945 was the moment when Truman met Stalin face to face for the first and only time, and the encounter was as revealing as it was consequential. The conference opened on July 17, 1945, in the Sicilienhof Palace in Potsdam, Germany, a vast, red brick building that had once belonged to the German crown prince, now surrounded by Soviet troops and the ruins of a civilization that had destroyed itself in pursuit of conquest. Truman arrived at Potsdam with a secret that would transform the entire strategic equation. On July 16, the day before the conference began, the United States had successfully detonated the first atomic bomb at Trinity Site in New Mexico. Secretary of War Stimson handed Truman a brief coded message that morning: "Babies satisfactorily born." Truman knew what it meant. He quietly told Stalin on July 24 that the United States possessed a new weapon of unusual destructive force, carefully avoiding the word atomic. Stalin's reaction was famously opaque. He nodded and said he hoped the Americans would make good use of it against Japan. Whether Stalin fully grasped what Truman was describing at that moment is debated by historians. Soviet intelligence, through agents like Klaus Fuchs embedded in the Manhattan Project, had been monitoring American nuclear development for years, and Stalin had already authorized a Soviet atomic program. But at Potsdam, the two men sat across a long table and negotiated the outlines of a post-war world while each harbored enormous secrets from the other. Truman pushed hard on Poland, on free elections, on the boundaries of Soviet influence. Stalin deflected, agreed in principle, and continued doing exactly what he intended. The conference produced agreements on the occupation zones of Germany, reparations, the administration of defeated Axis territories, but on the fundamental question of Eastern Europe's political future, Stalin gave nothing of substance. This is the exact midpoint of this story, and it is also the point at which everything that follows becomes the architecture of the modern world. If you have stayed with this narrative this far, it is because you understand that what happened between Truman and Stalin in those months was not merely a diplomatic disagreement. It was the opening movement of a conflict that would define the next half-century of human history. Please subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to understand where the Cold War truly began. Leave a comment below telling us the moment in this story that hit you hardest, or the fact that you had never encountered before. Your engagement helps this history reach more people who deserve to know it. The agreements of Yalta and the confrontations of 1945 were not abstractions. They were decisions made by specific men in specific rooms on specific dates, and those decisions determined whether millions of human beings would live in freedom or in fear. By the summer of 1945, Stalin had effectively secured control over Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and was consolidating influence over Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. The Iron Curtain, a phrase Churchill would make famous in his Fulton, Missouri speech on March 5, 1946, when he declared that, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent, was already being welded into place, rivet by rivet, arrest by arrest, election fraud by election fraud. The confrontation between Truman and Molotov in April 1945 had been the first American protest. It would not be the last. But those protests, however firm in language, could not change the fundamental reality. The Red Army occupied Eastern Europe, and short of a Third World War, which no one wanted and everyone feared, there was no mechanism to dislodge it. The full consequences of Stalin's consolidation of Eastern Europe became undeniable by 1947 and 1948. In February 1948, Czechoslovakia, the one Eastern European democracy that had survived the initial wave of Soviet-backed takeovers, fell to a communist coup. President Edvard Beneš, a man who had spent his life fighting for Czech democracy and had already once seen his country betrayed by Western powers at Munich in 1938, was forced to accept a communist government. Jan Masaryk, the beloved foreign minister and son of Czechoslovakia's founder, died on March 10, 1948, found in the courtyard below his foreign ministry apartment window. The official verdict was suicide. Most historians now believe he was murdered by Soviet security operatives. The death of Masaryk shocked the Western world in a way that previous Eastern European tragedies had not, perhaps because Czechoslovakia had been a genuine democracy, because Masaryk was an internationally respected figure, because his death made the human cost of appeasement viscerally real. Truman had already responded to the broader pattern with the Truman Doctrine, announced before a joint session of Congress on March 12, 1947, in which he declared that the United States would support free peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. This was specifically prompted by the communist insurgency in Greece and Soviet pressure on Turkey, but its implications were global. 3 months later, Secretary of State George Marshall, speaking at Harvard University on June 5, 1947, outlined the European Recovery Program, the Marshall Plan, which would channel approximately $13 billion into the reconstruction of Western Europe over the following 4 years, explicitly designed to prevent economic desperation from driving war-exhausted populations toward communism. Stalin refused to allow Eastern European nations to participate in the Marshall Plan, correctly recognizing it as both an act of American generosity and an instrument of American strategic influence. The Berlin blockade of June 1948 brought the conflict between the former Allies to its most dangerous point since the end of the war. Stalin, alarmed by Western plans to create a unified West German state and introduce a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, in the western occupation zones of Berlin, ordered the complete blockade of all land and water routes into West Berlin on June 24, 1948. West Berlin, a city of over 2 million people, sat deep inside the Soviet occupation zone of Germany. Stalin calculated that the Western powers would either accept Soviet terms or abandon the city, demonstrating to the German people and to the world that American protection was unreliable. Truman refused both options. He authorized the Berlin airlift, Operation Vittles, which began on June 26, 1948, and continued for 462 days, with American, British, and French aircraft flying nearly 300,000 missions and delivering over 2.3 million tons of supplies, including food, coal, and medicine. At the peak of the operation, a plane was landing in West Berlin every 90 seconds. Stalin had gambled that the logistical challenge would be insurmountable. He was wrong. The airlift worked. The blockade was lifted on May 12, 1949, and the Soviet Union had suffered a profound strategic and propaganda defeat. The man who had confronted Molotov in the Oval Office in April 1945 with 11 days of presidential experience had, 4 years later, organized one of the most remarkable humanitarian and logistical operations in modern history, demonstrating to the world that the United States would stand by its commitments in Europe regardless of Soviet pressure. It was, in many ways, the answer to the question that April 23, 1945 had posed: would America back its words with action? The confrontation between Truman and Stalin over Eastern Europe did not end with a single dramatic moment or a definitive victory for either side. It ended, if it can be said to have ended at all, with a divided continent, a divided Germany, a divided Berlin, and a world split into two armed camps that would spend the next 4 decades pointed at each other with weapons capable of ending civilization. Stalin died on March 5, 1953, in his dacha outside Moscow, reportedly after lying on the floor for hours while his terrified inner circle debated whether to disturb him. He died, by most accounts, without medical treatment that might have saved him, in a room full of men too frightened to help him. Truman had left office in January 1953, returning to Independence, Missouri, where he lived until his death on December 26, 1972. History has judged him more generously than his contemporaries did, a plain-spoken man from a small town who found himself at the center of events that would shape the entire second half of the 20th century, and who, on at least one April afternoon in 1945, looked a representative of Soviet power directly in the eye and said, "This far, and no further." The nations of Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, East Germany, and the Baltic states, would wait until 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Empire to experience the free elections that Yalta had promised them 44 years earlier. Some waited even longer. Their patience, their resistance, their survival are the most enduring part of this story. If this history moved you, if it taught you something you did not know, if it made the world a little more comprehensible, please subscribe to this channel, like this video, share it with someone who deserves to understand how the modern world was made, and leave a comment below telling us what moment in this story you will carry with you. History is not the past. It is the ground beneath our feet.